My name is Grace, and I'm 31 years old. I'm going to tell you about the night my father, Arthur, walked into a bookstore in downtown Chicago. He wasn't there to browse. He was there, I later found out, because someone had called him. A family friend, someone who thought he deserved a warning. What he saw when he walked through that door stopped him mid-step, my memoir. At the top of the bestseller display, his daughter's name on the cover in letters large enough to read from across the room. And his face went chalk white, not red, not furious, white. The color of a man who suddenly understands that the thing he spent thousands of dollars to prevent has already happened. Before I tell you about the truth he spent thousands to bury. And the moment he realized the daughter he silenced finally found a voice. Please like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, let me take you back. I grew up in a house that looked, from the outside, like a success story. Arthur was a respected financial consultant in our suburb. We had the right cars, the right zip code, the right Christmas cards. My mother, Linda, arranged flowers every Sunday and kept the house magazine quiet. And I was the child who kept ruining the picture, not because I was difficult, but because I noticed things. I noticed when the numbers didn't add up. I noticed when Arthur disappeared for long weekends with explanations that shifted depending on who he was talking to. I noticed the locked drawer in his home office and the way his voice changed when certain names came up on the phone. When I was 9, I told my mother that something felt wrong. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has said something embarrassing in public. "Grace," she said, "you have such a gift for drama." That was the first lesson. By the time I was 12, Arthur had a name for what I did. He called it drama, meant to embarrass the family. It didn't matter what I had actually seen or heard or found. The act of naming it, the act of saying this is real, was the offense. The truth wasn't the problem. My mouth was, so I learned to close it. I became what psychologists would later help me understand as the invisible child. I was present at every family dinner, every holiday, every carefully staged photograph. But I learned through years of trial and consequence that my job was to exist without speaking, to observe without reporting, to absorb the weight of everything I knew and carry it without letting it show on my face. That's a particular kind of damage. It doesn't leave bruises. It leaves something quieter and harder to name. It taught me that my perception was a liability, that the things I saw clearly were somehow the most dangerous things about me. Therapists call it conditional self-worth. Said the unspoken contract that says you are acceptable here only when you are silent. You are loved here only when you do not inconvenience the story we have agreed to tell. I signed that contract in the wordless way children sign things. I signed it every time I stopped a sentence halfway through, every time I swallowed a question, every time I sat across from Arthur at the dinner table and looked at my plate instead of his eyes. I was learning to survive. I didn't know yet that I was also collecting material. The architecture of our silence was built one brick at a time. And I was the only one in that house who ever counted the bricks. I was 22 when I found the folder. Arthur traveled frequently for work. That particular weekend, my mother was at her sister's in Cincinnati, and I had come home to collect some belongings I'd left during a previous visit. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a charger in what I thought was an unlocked drawer. The drawer wasn't locked that day. Inside was a folder, cream-colored, thick, held shut with a rubber band that had been wrapped around it so many times it had started to indent the cardboard. I almost put it back. I want to be honest about that moment, too. There was a part of me, the part that had spent a decade learning to keep my mouth shut, that said, "Close the drawer, Grace." I didn't. What was inside was not a single devastating document. It was a collection. Statements. Letters between Arthur and a man I'll call Raymond, a business partner whose name I had heard exactly once at a dinner when I was 16, and never again. Wire transfer records, a drafted non-disclosure agreement that had never been fully executed. And a letter, handwritten from a woman named Carla, addressed to my father, dated 6 years earlier. The letter was 2 pages. I read it standing at his desk. I read it twice. Arthur had been routing client funds through a shell account he co-managed with Raymond. Small amounts, consistently, across hundreds of clients over several years. Not enough to trigger immediate alerts. Enough accumulated to matter significantly. Carla was an accountant who had discovered the pattern and had written to Arthur privately, apparently giving him the opportunity to correct it before she went further. There was no evidence that he had corrected anything. There was evidence in the form of a subsequent wire transfer to an account in Carla's name that the situation had been resolved by other means. I put the folder back. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for 40 minutes without moving. Then I called him. I didn't accuse. I didn't make demands. I told him calmly what I had seen. I told him I didn't know what to do with it. I told him I thought we should talk. The silence on his end of the phone lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then, keep your mouth shut. Not loud, not panicked. Quiet. The same quietness he had used my entire childhood to signal that a conversation was over. Your little stories are just a cry for attention. You've always needed to be the center of something. Within a week, he had hired a public relations consultant, Boing. Within 3 weeks, I received a letter from a lawyer I had never heard of, referencing potential defamation liability and the emotional and reputational harm that could result from the reckless dissemination of misunderstood private documents. I had told no one but him. The money he spent on that initial effort, the PR consultant, the legal letter, a subsequent family mediation session that was really an intervention designed to get me to recant what I had seen, came to, as I later learned through my own careful documentation, just over $40,000. $40,000 to manage one daughter who had read a folder. And when the money didn't work, when I sat in that mediation room and refused quietly to say that I had misunderstood what I had seen, the family moved to the next strategy, erasure. The invitation stopped. The group texts I was removed from without announcement. The holiday that my mother hosted and somehow forgot to mention to me until 3 days afterward. My younger brother, coached or genuinely convinced, I still don't know which, stopped returning my calls. Parentification runs in both directions. Sometimes the family asks the child to carry the secret, and when the child refuses, They ask her to carry the blame for breaking what was already broken. I carried it for a while. Then I started writing it down. My alarm went off at 1:45 every morning, not because I needed to be anywhere, but because by 2 a.m., the version of me that had spent 8 hours doing compliance work at a mid-sized financial firm, the version of me that smiled and answered emails and ate lunch at my desk and gave no indication that anything was wrong, that version finally went quiet. And the one who needed to write could come forward. I worked on a second-hand laptop at a kitchen table in a studio apartment I could barely afford. I drank tea I'd been steeping too long because I kept forgetting it. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building where the radiator knocked every 20 minutes, like a reminder that I was still awake, still here, still doing this. I wrote the way you write when you're not sure anyone will ever read it. Which is to say, honestly, without performance, without the particular shape-shifting that happens when you're aware of an audience. I wrote about the drawer. I wrote about the mediation session and the lawyer's letter, and the moment my mother called 9 months after the erasure and said simply, "I hope you're doing well," as though we were acquaintances who had lost touch through geography rather than through my refusal to lie. I wrote about conditional self-worth in the language I had only recently learned to use, having finally found a therapist I trusted. I wrote about the specific texture of growing up as the family's designated problem, the one whose perception was always the issue rather than the thing she was perceiving. I wrote for 2 years, and then I did something I had never planned to do. I sent 40 pages to Eleanor. Eleanor was not a family member. She was not a friend in the traditional sense. She was a retired acquisitions editor I had met at a writing workshop I had attended almost on a dare to myself, the kind of thing I signed up for and then sat in the back of, convinced I had no business being there. Eleanor had run the literary division of a respected publishing house for 23 years. She had white hair she kept pinned carelessly, and a habit of saying exactly what she thought about a sentence in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. She called me 8 days after I sent the pages. "This is real," she said. "Don't soften it." She became, over the following year, the first person who showed up consistently and without condition for the version of me that was trying to tell the truth. She read every draft. She pushed back when I hedged. She told me once, during a phone call when I admitted I was considering stopping, "Family isn't blood. It's who shows up for the truth." I wrote that in the margin of my manuscript and didn't cross it out. Eleanor connected me with a literary agent she trusted. The agent read the full manuscript in a weekend and called me on a Monday morning, her voice careful and professional in the way that people get when they are trying not to show that they are excited. She said she believed in it. She said she wanted to submit it. The manuscript sold at auction within 3 weeks. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment when my agent called with the news. Not in the chair, not on the couch, on the floor, trying to understand the distance between the child who had been told her perception was a problem and the woman whose account of that perception a major publishing house had just agreed to put into the world. The daughter who causes drama. The voice the world was apparently waiting to listen to. Those two sentences lived in me simultaneously for a long time. Honestly, they still do. But I kept going, because Eleanor had told me not to soften it, and I had promised her I wouldn't. The bookstore was on Michigan Avenue. I had walked past it dozens of times over the years, the kind of place with tall windows and wooden floors, and the particular smell of new books, clean and slightly chemical, and full of some promise I couldn't name. I had walked past it when I was a compliance analyst with a secret manuscript. I had walked past it when I was still telling myself no one would ever read it. Now my name was on a sign in the window. The signing was a Saturday afternoon, and the room they had set up in the back of the store was full by the time I arrived. I remember the sound of it. Low conversation, the movement of chairs, someone near the front laughing at something her friend had said. My publicist, a precise and calm woman named Dana, guided me through the back entrance and handed me a pen. "The line is long," she said. "Take your time with each person." The book had debuted at #1 the previous Tuesday. I still had not fully processed what that meant. What I knew, concretely, was that the clink of that pen on the signing table felt like the most real sound I had heard in years. Each signature was a small, physical confirmation that I had not imagined any of it. Not the drawer, not the erasure, not the 2 a.m. drafts, not Eleanor's voice on the phone saying, "Don't soften it." I was 40 minutes into the signing when Dana appeared at my shoulder. "There's a man in the hallway," she said. Her voice was quiet. "He says he's your father." I set the pen down. I thanked the reader in front of me. I walked to the hallway. Arthur was standing near the emergency exit in a coat that looked expensive and slightly too formal for a Saturday afternoon bookstore. He looked older than I remembered. He looked, for the first time in my life, like a man who was uncertain of what was about to happen. He spoke first. He said that this had gone far enough. He said that whatever point I was trying to make, I had made it, and that I needed to consider what I was doing to the people who loved me. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. I watched them. The slight trembling at the fingers. The way he kept adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, like the movement could reset something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move toward him. I said, "There are 200 people in that room who have already read it, Dad." "It's done." He asked me, and I want to be precise about how he said this, because the entitlement in it was its own kind of document. He asked me if I understood what this was doing to his reputation. I looked at him for a moment. "You should read the dedication page," I said. He had a copy. I don't know when he had gotten it, Trey. But he opened it there in the hallway, and I watched his face as he read the 12 words I had written beneath my parents' names. For everyone who was told their truth was too small to matter. The color left his face the way color leaves a photograph left in the sun. Slowly, then completely. He had spent $40,000 to keep a drawer's worth of documents private. What was now in the world was not just the documents. It was every mediation session, every unanswered call, every time a child was told her perception was drama. It was the architecture of the silence itself, examined and named and published in 73,000 words. He could not buy that back. I returned to the signing table. I picked up the pen. I thanked the next person in line for waiting. If you were in my shoes, would you have signed a copy for him? Type yes or no in the comments. He called 3 more times before I blocked his number. The first call was strategic, measured, controlled, the voice of a man who had decided to try reason. He said he understood that I was hurt. He said that he was willing to discuss things privately if I agreed to stop doing press. He used the phrase family loyalty 4 times in 6 minutes. I counted. The second call was less controlled. The third was a voicemail I have never listened to in full. I got 90 seconds in and stopped. Not because it was devastating, because I recognized the structure of it. It was the same architecture that had governed my childhood. The suggestion that my speaking was the problem, that my silence was the solution, that the appropriate response to having been erased was to make myself smaller again and call that forgiveness. I had done enough work at that point to know the difference between forgiveness and compliance. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. A producer from a national morning program called Dana to request an interview. Then a podcast. Then a profile in a publication I had read since college. Each time, Arthur's response, delivered through my younger brother who had re-entered my life cautiously and with what I believe was genuine uncertainty about what to feel, was the same. She needs to stop. She's humiliating the family. I did every interview, not from anger. I want to be careful here because the anger is the explanation people expect, and it is not the accurate one. I did the interviews because the readers who came to my signing and stood in a line that stretched to the front of the store had told me things, so they leaned across the table while I was signing their copies, and they said quietly that they recognized it. The invisible child, the conditional love, the family secret they had been asked to carry like a stone sewn into the lining of a coat they could never take off. I was not the only one. The burden of family secrets is not a personal wound in isolation. It is a pattern, specific and repeatable, passed from one generation to the next, through silence, enforced as loyalty. What I had written was not just my account of a drawer and a folder and a father who made his daughter disappear. It was, apparently, a language some people had been waiting for someone else to speak first. Arthur made one final attempt. He sent a letter through his attorney. Formal, documented, requesting that I refrain from further public characterizations of family members and citing, again, potential reputational harm. The letter arrived on a Thursday. I read it at my kitchen table, not the second-hand one from the studio apartment. A new table in a different apartment, purchased with money from the advance. I set the letter down. I thought about what I wanted to say. Then I wrote him back. Myself, no attorney. I'm not seeking revenge, Dad. I'm just providing the truth you couldn't buy. He did not respond. What I have now is not a dramatic resolution. I want to be clear about that because stories are supposed to end with something that feels like a gate closing, a lock turning, a clean click of completion. That is not what healing actually feels like. Healing feels like waking up on a Tuesday and realizing you have not spent the first 20 minutes of your morning managing the weight of someone else's secret. It feels like answering a question about your childhood without calculating, first, what the answer will cost you. It feels like the absence of labor you had stopped noticing you were doing. I no longer carry Arthur's story. I carry mine. And mine. The one I wrote at 2 a.m. on a secondhand laptop in an apartment where the radiator knocked every 20 minutes. Was, it turned out, worth something. Not because it exposed him, but because it freed me. Eleanor told me once that the book would change my life. She was right, but not in the way I expected. It didn't give me power over my father. It gave me back the power I had handed him at 9 years old when I first learned to keep my mouth shut. If you are carrying something you were told to keep quiet, I want you to hear this clearly. Setting boundaries isn't revenge. It's survival. And you deserve to be chosen first, not by the people who conditioned your silence, by yourself. I'm Grace. Thank you for being here.